At the gala entrance, just as the lights of the chandeliers spilled onto the marble floor, his daughter leaned close, her words slicing colder than the winter air outside. "Dad, please, don't embarrass us tonight." It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. A lifetime of sacrifice folded into a single whisper meant to erase him. His hand tightened around the wooden cane, knuckles whitening, the weight of decades pressing down. He nodded once, because what else could a father do in that moment? Yet inside, something cracked, the soundless fracture of a man reduced from cornerstone to burden. He stood there for a moment, rooted, while laughter and voices carried into the hall. He had built so much with his bare hands, carried more than they would ever know, and yet he was being ushered into invisibility. Guests passed by, adjusting ties and gowns, glancing at him as if he were just another relic propped at the edge of celebration. His daughter's eyes darted nervously from one familiar face to another, as if his very presence were a threat to the fragile mask of perfection she had sewn around her life. The cane felt heavier than ever, not because of age, but because of humiliation. He remembered holding her tiny hand when she first learned to walk, when she stumbled and he steadied her. He remembered her tears when bullies mocked her, and how he told her, "Your worth is not in their words, but in your heart." Now those same lessons echoed back like cruel irony, because tonight it was her voice branding him unworthy. Around him the air hummed with music and chatter, glasses clinking in the distance, waiters moving gracefully, yet all he heard was the coldness in her tone. "Don't embarrass us," as though he were not her father, but an old shadow better hidden in the corner. It wasn't shame she carried, it was fear. Fear that the lines on his face, the weariness in his step, the simplicity of his clothes might fracture the polished image she wanted to show the world. He swallowed, the lump in his throat sharper than broken glass. Pride had never been his pursuit. He had lived quietly, built honestly, sacrificed silently, and yet silence had turned into invisibility. He looked at her one last time before stepping into the hall. Her smile for others was warm, dazzling, rehearsed. For him, it was absence, an unspoken plea that he not exist too loudly. And so he walked in, slowly, each step echoing louder than her whisper. Inside, the room glowed with elegance, but in his chest burned a darker fire. He said nothing. He would not beg for space at their table, nor for dignity in their eyes. But somewhere deep within, beyond the humiliation, a truth lingered, patient and unshakable. The night would not end as it had begun. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with your friends. Your support helps us grow this channel and bring you more stories every day. Now, let's continue. The hall shimmered with a golden glow, chandeliers pouring light across polished tables where crystal glasses sparkled and silver cutlery gleamed. Laughter rose in waves, a current of joy and pride, families leaning close to each other as if sharing secrets wrapped in celebration. The orchestra played softly in the corner, strings weaving a gentle rhythm that gave the room its pulse. To everyone else, it was a night of beauty, of triumph, of memories being made. But for him, seated at the edge of it all, it was a night of shadows. His chair was slightly away from the circle of light, angled as though forgotten, or perhaps intentionally placed out of view. The warmth of the room never reached him. It stayed where the smiles clustered, where his daughter and her family sparkled in their elegant clothes, drawing admiration with every laugh and gesture. He sat quietly, adjusting his cane beside him, a spectator in what should have been a story he had helped write. Every table in the hall was full of conversations, voices rising with excitement about careers, achievements, and plans for the future. Yet not a single word reached him, as though he were a stranger who had wandered in by mistake. He looked at the plate set before others. Rich meals served with precision. Glasses filled and refilled without pause. His own plate felt colder, not because the food was absent, but because no hand had remembered to ask if he wanted more. No voice had turned to include him. He was present in body, invisible in spirit. The humiliation was sharper because it was wrapped in courtesy, polite nods, empty smiles, glances that slid over him like rain over stone. He knew this pattern too well. Acknowledgement without presence, tolerance without welcome. Memories tugged at him as he watched his daughter laughing with colleagues, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm as she charmed the circle around them. He remembered her first recital, when her hands trembled over the piano keys and he whispered from the front row, "I'm here. Don't be afraid." He had clapped the loudest then, his pride louder than the music itself. Tonight, that same daughter looked through him as though the years of devotion were just dust on her polished evening gown. The applause of strangers mattered to her more than the heartbeat of the man who had once carried her on his shoulders when she was too tired to walk. He lowered his eyes, staring at the tablecloth, the delicate embroidery blurred by the heaviness in his chest. Around him, the room glittered with belonging, but not for him. It struck him deeply how cruel invisibility could feel when it came not from strangers, but from one's own blood. He felt not just forgotten, but erased, as if his name, his sacrifices, his entire story had been edited out of the narrative being celebrated tonight. And yet, beneath the ache, there was a quiet endurance. He had lived his life carrying burdens heavier than shame. He had carried bricks and wood, debts and sleepless nights, storms and disappointments. Tonight, he carried silence, and silence, though it wounded, also strengthened. He watched the glow of the hall, not as a beggar for acknowledgement, but as a man who knew something his daughter did not yet realize. Light can shift, and sometimes the glow that blinds others will soon shine on the one they tried to cast aside. The evening unfolded like a play in which he had been written out of the script. People noticed him, old neighbors, colleagues from years past, men who had once worked beside him when sweat and calloused hands built the very structures this city now thrived upon. They approached with warmth, smiles etched with respect, their voices carrying genuine recognition. "It's been so long. How are you? We've missed you." Their greetings were not hollow. They carried the weight of shared history, the kind of bonds that never fully erode with time. And yet, as soon as his daughter's circle caught sight of these exchanges, their faces stiffened. Her husband turned away mid-conversation, pretending not to hear. She lifted her glass too quickly, as if drowning her unease in a sip of champagne. The grandchildren looked down at their phones, screens glowing brighter than their grandfather's presence. It was deliberate, this silence, this exclusion. More painful than anger, more cutting than insult, to be ignored, to be erased while still alive, is a wound that bleeds inward, unseen by the crowd. He sat straighter in his chair, every muscle tense, because the laughter that bubbled around him was no longer innocent. It was calculated. The way they avoided his gaze, the way their conversations suddenly turned more animated whenever he drew near, it was a theater of dismissal, as though his very existence was a flaw in their performance of elegance. He thought of the nights he had stayed awake at the kitchen table, sorting through bills so they would never see the weight of debt. He thought of the winters when his coat was thin because he'd bought new ones for them instead. Every sacrifice had been a quiet prayer that one day they would see him not just as a father, but as a foundation. Tonight, in this hall, surrounded by strangers who knew his worth better than his own blood, He realized that foundation had been painted over, hidden beneath their polished walls of pride. Still, not everyone was blind. A man he had once mentored, now gray-haired himself, clasped his shoulder with tears in his eyes. "I wouldn't be here without you," he whispered before returning to his seat. Another guest bowed slightly, reverently, in acknowledgement. Their respect was not loud, not boastful, but real, and in that respect he felt a flicker of strength. His daughter might try to erase him from her story, but the world beyond her pride remembered the truth. Yet the exclusion cut deeper as the night went on. He was not asked to stand for a toast, not invited into photographs, not welcomed into the warm circles of conversation. He became the man at the edge of the frame, the silent figure blurred into the background. And though his face burned with the sting of rejection, he did not rise to protest. His silence became armor. He would not beg for place or attention. Dignity, once fractured, is not restored by pleading. It is restored by time, by truth, by the quiet endurance of a man who knows that the story is not finished. The exclusion that was meant to humiliate him was slowly becoming their own shame. For every guest who shook his hand, for every respectful nod that reached him from across the room, the contrast grew sharper. The world remembered him, honored him, while his own blood chose to turn away. And in that sharpness, in that growing tension, he sensed a shift was coming, one that none of them could control. He sat there in the half-shadow, the laughter of others swelling around him like a tide, and memory began to press down heavier than the weight of years. The hall blurred for a moment, and in its place rose images from the past, the nights when his body ached from labor, but he refused to rest until the last brick was laid on the home they now called theirs. He remembered lifting beams with trembling arms, his back bent but unbroken, whispering to himself that this roof would shelter them, that this house would be the anchor for every dream his children dared to dream. Every wall had been his sacrifice, every floorboard his silent gift. He had left pieces of his soul in that home, and tonight, with just a whisper, "Don't embarrass us," that entire history was being swept aside, as if erased by a careless hand. He thought of the long winters when the coal stove burned too faintly for his own comfort, but his children never went to school with blue lips or trembling hands. He thought of the worn shoes he patched again and again so his daughter could wear new ones without shame among her classmates. He thought of the late hours spent reading to her by a single lamp, his eyes burning from exhaustion, but his voice steady, determined that she would know books, that she would know opportunity, that she would walk paths wider than his own tired footsteps. Every exam she passed, every graduation she celebrated, had been etched into his chest like medals he would never wear, but cherished nonetheless. And now, she sat only a few tables away, dazzling and radiant, basking in recognition that would never have been hers had his hands not bled, his shoulders not bent beneath the weight of her future. Yet when her eyes brushed his, there was no gratitude, no warmth, only the cold request that he not exist too loudly. The very foundation of her pride was built upon his silence, his invisibility, his willingness to carry the burden and never demand acknowledgement. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the orchestra's music fade into the background. And for a moment he heard again the echo of small footsteps running down the hallway of the house he built, the laughter of a little girl calling, "Daddy, wait for me." That voice, bright and trusting, had been his reason for everything. Tonight, that same voice was sharpened into a blade of rejection, a weapon aimed at the man who had given her everything he could. The memory burned, but it also steadied him, because beneath the humiliation was a deeper truth. No whisper, no dismissal, no polished performance of elegance could erase the reality of what had been done. Every brick still carried his fingerprints. Every page she had studied bore the shadow of the lamp he had lit. His legacy was written into the marrow of her life, whether she chose to acknowledge it or not. And as he sat there, excluded but unbroken, A quiet realization began to rise within him. They could cast him aside. They could pretend he did not belong. They could try to erase his name from their story, but the story was larger than them. It had been written not in whispers of shame, but in years of sacrifice, in nights of endurance, in love that asked for nothing in return. And that story could not be erased, not tonight, not ever. The music softened, the clinking of glasses quieted, and a hush spread across the hall as the host of the evening stepped forward to the microphone. His presence commanded attention with the ease of a practiced master of ceremonies. Conversations died down, chairs shifted slightly as people turned toward the stage. A beam of light caught the host's face, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire room tilted toward him. From his corner seat the old man watched, his hands folded over the cane, prepared for nothing more than to fade further into the background. He had no expectations, no illusions. He believed his role tonight was to be a shadow, a silent figure tolerated but unnecessary, sitting at the edge of celebration while others basked in recognition. The host cleared his throat, smiling, his voice rich and warm as it carried through the speakers. Words of welcome, of gratitude for the gathering, of honor for the achievements of those present. Laughter rose at a well-placed jest. Applause followed a gesture toward the sponsors, and the rhythm of the evening resumed like a tide. To all who listened, it was the beginning of something grand, a crescendo building toward a revelation. But for the man in the shadows, it was simply another reminder that this stage was not his, that his name would not be spoken, that he had long been written out of stories that others now told with pride. He sat still, head slightly bowed, the weight of his daughter's earlier whisper still clinging to him like chains. "Don't embarrass us." That phrase had prepared him for invisibility, for the certainty that even as names were honored and achievements praised, his would be left unspoken. He was ready to bear it with dignity, to endure quietly, because he had been enduring all his life. Tonight was just another test of silence. Yet, as he watched the host scan the room, as he felt the tension of anticipation ripple through the guests, a strange stillness came over him. The chandeliers sparkled brighter, the faces in the crowd blurred together, and suddenly he was struck by the thought that truth, though buried, has a way of rising. He did not know what would happen next, whether the evening would pass him by like so many others, or whether something unexpected might shift the weight of the room. But deep inside, beyond the ache of humiliation, he felt the faintest flicker of possibility, like a coal glowing in ashes. The host's pause stretched longer than usual, as if he too felt the gravity of the moment. The room leaned forward collectively, waiting, and the man, still seated in the shadows, closed his fingers tighter around the cane, steadying himself not with expectation, but with quiet endurance. He was ready to remain invisible, but he also knew, sometimes invisibility is broken not by force, not by plea, but by the undeniable call of truth, when the world least expects it. The host's gaze swept across the glittering hall, his smile softening into something more solemn, his words caught for a moment in deliberate silence. That silence was heavy, thicker than the velvet curtains framing the stage, pressing down until even the laughter from the distant tables faltered. Guests shifted in their seats, sensing the gravity that often precedes revelation. The old man, still seated at the edge of the glow, felt his chest tighten, not from expectation, but from weariness. He had been invisible so long tonight that he assumed this pause was meant only for another family, another story, another achievement worth showcasing. He lowered his eyes, bracing for the sound of someone else's name to thunder through the microphone. Then it came. Not the name, but the words. The host's voice rose, clear and resonant, carrying across every corner of the room like a bell that no one could ignore. Tonight, we honor a man whose name cannot be forgotten. The air shifted instantly. Glasses hovered midair, frozen in half-raised toasts. The echo of conversation died completely. All that remained was the weight of those words. trembling like a spark that had landed on dry kindling. The old man's heart lurched. For a moment he wondered if he had imagined it, if his mind, tired from humiliation, aching from memory, had invented the phrase as a cruel trick of longing. But the silence of the crowd confirmed otherwise. Faces turned, curious, expectant, searching for the one whose identity had not yet been revealed. His daughter's posture stiffened, her smile faltering into a mask of unease. She clutched her glass tighter. Her husband leaned closer to whisper something sharp. The children looked up from their glowing screens. They knew before the name was spoken. They feared it, resisted it, and in their fear he saw truth dawning. The host's words grew louder, more deliberate. He spoke of decades of service, of sacrifices unseen but transformative, of a life poured into building not just structures, but futures. He spoke of a legacy that had shaped lives far beyond family circles, a story that had been quietly carried in the marrow of the city itself. And with every sentence, the laughter that once excluded the old man turned into silence that included him, drew him into the center without his even moving from his chair. He sat trembling, not with weakness, but with the weight of something he had stopped expecting. Recognition. It pressed against him, heavy as stone, and yet light as air, lifting him from the shadows where his daughter had tried to hide him. The host had not yet spoken his name, but already the hall felt different. Already the tide had shifted. The old man could feel it in his bones, in the sudden heat in his chest, in the way eyes began to glance his way with dawning realization. The truth, long buried in silence, had begun to rise. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache of betrayal, beneath the loneliness of exclusion, his heart whispered, "This night will not belong to their shame. It will belong to the truth they cannot bury." The lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, the hall seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sudden flash, the great screen behind the host lit up, and the first image appeared. It was an old photograph, grainy yet powerful, a construction site from decades past, beams of steel stretching toward the sky, and there, at the center, stood the younger version of the man now sitting in the shadows, his hands calloused, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his eyes sharp with determination. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Another image followed, the opening of a factory, his handshake with workers who looked at him, not as a boss, but as one of their own. Then another, a hospital ward filled with children, nurses smiling, a ribbon being cut by the very man whose presence his daughter had tried to erase tonight. The audience leaned forward. Page after page of his life unfolded before them, not written in ink, but captured in photographs, headlines, and history. Newspaper articles appeared. Local builder funds new school wing. Anonymous donor provides scholarships for dozens of students. Community leader honored for lifelong service. His name shone in bold letters, etched into stories of resilience and generosity that had touched lives beyond counting. His face appeared again and again, not hidden, not diminished, but central, undeniable. The image of a man whose quiet sacrifices had become the pillars of a city. The hall was silent now, except for the soft turning of heads toward him. The spotlight from the screen spilled onto his seat, painting him in gold. He felt the weight of every eye, some wide with surprise, others clouded with shame for having ignored him only moments earlier. And among those faces was his daughter's, her painted smile crumbling, her eyes darting desperately as if to deny what the world was now forced to see. She had told him not to embarrass them, but now the truth, larger than her pride, brighter than her denial, stood before everyone. The embarrassment was not his, it was hers. He could hardly breathe. It was overwhelming to see decades of toil, forgotten even by his own family, suddenly resurrected in front of strangers. Yet with that weight came something softer, something that steadied his trembling hands. Vindication. The world knew. The truth had not been buried after all. Every brick he had laid, every hour he had sacrificed, every unspoken gift. It had not vanished. It lived here, in memory, in gratitude, in proof no one could erase. And as the images flickered, shifting from factories to schools, from hospitals to smiling faces of children holding diplomas, the applause began. Not loud at first, but steady, rising like a tide breaking against a seawall. It grew and grew until the hall shook with it, until the sound drowned out every whisper of doubt, every echo of rejection. It was not just applause for achievements. It was recognition of a life lived with dignity, of a legacy stronger than pride, louder than betrayal. For the first time that night, he lifted his head fully, his shoulders straightening, his eyes no longer lowered. He did not need to speak. The photograph spoke. The headline spoke. The applause spoke. His life, once cast aside as though it were an old coat, had stepped into the center of the stage, undeniable and unerasable. She sat frozen, her posture still elegant, her dress still perfect, her hair shimmering under the chandeliers, but none of it mattered now. The smile she had rehearsed so carefully cracked at the edges, faltering under the weight of the truth flashing across the screen. Her cheeks, once painted with a glow of pride, now burned with something she could not hide, shame. But it was not the shame she had feared. The imagined embarrassment of her father's presence, of his simple clothes and weathered cane. No, this shame was born of truth, a truth she had spent years trying to bury under polish and pretense, now unveiled in front of everyone she had wanted to impress. Each word the host spoke landed like a blow. He spoke of years of service, of sacrifices unrecognized, of lives changed because of a man too humble to boast of his own deeds. Every sentence stripped her carefully built facade of control. She had believed she was protecting herself, protecting her family's image, by asking him to remain invisible. Yet now the entire hall saw what she had tried to hide. Not his weakness, but his strength. Not his irrelevance, but his greatness. And in their eyes, the true embarrassment lay not on the father, but on the daughter who had denied him. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her glass. She tried to sip, but the liquid caught in her throat. Around her, people shifted, stealing glances in her direction. Some eyes were sympathetic, others sharp with judgment. She could feel the weight of their thoughts, unspoken but deafening. How could she have silenced him? How could she have dismissed the very man whose life had carried her here? The admiration she craved was slipping away, replaced with whispers she could not control. She had wanted to shine tonight, to be seen as refined, accomplished, worthy of esteem. Instead, she sat under the harsh light of truth, her father's shadow, no, his radiance, outshining her completely. Her children, seated beside her, looked up from their phones at last. Their eyes were wide, confused. They had never known their grandfather's story, never been told the depth of what he had done. For them, he had always been the quiet old man in the corner, tolerated but dismissed. Now they saw photographs of hospitals, schools, scholarships, lives rebuilt. They saw a man their mother had belittled, standing larger than life across the screen. In their young hearts, admiration stirred, mingled with shame. And she felt it, felt the shift, the betrayal of her own narrative unraveling in the faces of her children. She tried to compose herself, to straighten her shoulders, to wear indifference like armor. But dignity cannot be faked when truth has stripped you bare. Her father sat only a few tables away, silent, calm, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in quiet endurance. He had not needed to defend himself. The world had spoken for him, and in that silence her own voice, her own authority, shriveled. She had told him not to embarrass them. Instead, she was the one drowning in embarrassment, not because of him, but because of her own blindness, her own pride. The hall no longer looked at her as the host's guest of honor's daughter. They looked at her as the child who had forgotten the hand that built her path, and there was no mask, no charm, no perfect smile that could erase that truth. At first, it was only a few hands, hesitant claps breaking the silence like small drops of rain on still water. Then, one after another, more palms met in rhythm, the sound spreading across the hall. The applause grew steady and sure until it became impossible to ignore. Guests rose to their feet row by row until the entire hall stood tall, a sea of people unified not by politeness but by awe. The sound crashed through the chandeliers, ricocheted against the marble walls, and filled every corner with thunderous reverence. His name, spoken by the host and echoed in whispers throughout the crowd, rose above it all, louder than the whisper his daughter had carved into his heart earlier. "Don't embarrass us." That whisper dissolved now, drowned under the roar of gratitude that belonged to him and him alone. He remained seated at first, gripping his cane, his body trembling, not with weakness, but with the weight of this moment. He had endured years of silence, swallowed humiliations too heavy to name, and learned to live invisible, even in his own family's presence. Now the world, the very community he had built and served, forced him out of that invisibility, not with shame, but with honor. He looked up slowly, his eyes wet, not from frailty, but from a surge of emotion too vast to contain. And as the applause swelled higher, as people called his name with reverence, he felt dignity return to him, not as a gift, but as something that had always been his, now finally recognized. His daughter stood amidst the ovation, but her body was rigid, her face pale. She clapped mechanically, her palms barely meeting, because to remain seated would have marked her guilt for all to see. Yet every strike of hands around her was a judgment, a mirror reflecting the truth she could not deny. The man she had tried to hide was the very man the world honored. Her shame was no longer private. It was public, exposed by the standing ovation that made her silence louder than any confession. The grandchildren, once buried in their phones, stood too, their eyes wide as they joined in the applause. For the first time, they saw not just Grandpa, but a man whose legacy reached far beyond family dinners and quiet corners. Their small hands clapped with genuine wonder, their cheers mingling with the storm of recognition that filled the room. In that moment, their perspective shifted forever. No whisper could erase what they had witnessed with their own eyes. The host raised his hand, but the applause would not stop. It surged again, relentless, as though the entire hall was determined to repay decades of unspoken gratitude in a single evening. Strangers who had benefited from his work shouted thanks. Others wept quietly, moved by the sight of a man who had given so much without asking for recognition, finally standing at the center of it. And still, he had not moved, had not spoken. His silence, steady and unbroken, was more powerful than any speech. And when at last the ovation reached its peak, when the sound of hundreds of hands collided into a single thunder that shook the hall, he rose. Slowly, with dignity, with the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove and everything already written in his life's work, he stood. And as he stood, the applause turned into something greater, a tribute, a declaration, an acknowledgement that no betrayal, no dismissal, no whispered command to stay quiet could ever erase him. That night, the hall did not belong to the elegant gowns, the glittering chandeliers, or the carefully rehearsed smiles. It belonged to him, to his name, to the truth. He rose with deliberate care, his hand tightening around the polished wood of his cane, the other pressing against the table to steady himself. The hall fell even quieter in that instant, not because the applause had stopped, but because the sound had transformed. What began as clapping was now a living force, a storm of respect that seemed to breathe with every step he prepared to take. He stood straight, taller than his years allowed, his frame frail but unbroken, his dignity gathering around him like a cloak. And when he moved, slowly, carefully, The rhythm of the room shifted. Each tap of the cane against the floor was like the beating of a drum, each step a heartbeat that pulsed through the silence. People leaned aside as he walked forward, the crowd parting not from courtesy, but from reverence. To them he was no longer the old man tucked away in the corner, no longer the shadow his daughter had tried to hide. They saw something greater. In his slow walk, they saw decades of struggle, nights without sleep, sacrifices that had built schools and hospitals, scholarships and futures. They saw endurance carved into bone, resilience etched into every line of his face. His body carried the marks of time, but his steps carried the weight of history. His daughter's eyes followed him, her hand trembling around her glass. She had asked him not to embarrass them, and yet here he was, walking, steady, silent, every gaze in the hall fixed upon him, not with mockery, not with pity, but with awe. The embarrassment she feared was nowhere to be found. What filled the air instead was honor. What shone in the eyes of strangers was gratitude. What burned in her own reflection was shame. She sank lower in her chair, as if the grandeur of his walk exposed the smallness of her pride. The grandchildren stood taller now, clapping with enthusiasm, their young faces alight with discovery. They were witnessing not just a grandfather, but a living testament to something greater than wealth or titles. In the echo of his footsteps, they heard courage. In the steadiness of his gait, they saw greatness. No storybook could have taught them this lesson. It was unfolding before their very eyes. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The stage was not rushing anywhere. It had been waiting for him all along. The applause swelled again, a tidal wave rising as he reached the foot of the stairs. Some guests wiped tears from their eyes. Others placed hands over their hearts. The host extended his arm, but even he seemed humbled, as though he too understood that this moment was larger than ceremony, larger than himself. And so, one hand on the cane, one on the railing, the old man began to climb. Step by step, he ascended not only the stairs, but also the story his daughter had denied him. No longer the forgotten, no longer the silenced. With each step, he claimed his place, not through anger, not through words, but through the undeniable power of presence. By the time he reached the stage, the hall was trembling with sound. And in that trembling, the people no longer saw an old man walking slowly. They saw a legend rising. The stage lights poured down on him as he reached the top, illuminating every line of his weathered face, every shadow carved by years of sacrifice. The host, with reverence in his eyes, held the award in both hands, as though it were more than metal and glass, as though it were the crystallization of decades, of labor, of dignity too long unspoken. The applause quieted into a reverent hush, the kind of silence that trembles with expectation, and then the words rang out, steady and clear. Your name has become part of our history, of our city, of our memory. The weight of those words struck deeper than any insult ever could. For years his name had been spoken only in whispers, often dismissed, sometimes ignored. Tonight, it was declared aloud, carved into the very air, impossible to erase. The host's voice carried beyond walls, beyond chandeliers. It carried into the marrow of everyone listening, into the hearts of strangers who now knew they stood in the presence of something greater than ceremony. The old man's breath caught as the award was placed into his trembling hands. Heavy, not because of its material, but because it bore the weight of a lifetime that had seemed invisible, now lifted high before all. The room shifted again. People leaned forward, eyes shining, some with tears they did not hide. The young men and women he had once sponsored, now grown and accomplished, clapped the hardest, their faces glowing with gratitude. Guests who had never met him felt their hearts swell as they realized they were witnessing the honoring of a man who had lived not for applause, but for service, And in that moment, the applause returned, not wild, not careless, but thunderous with meaning. It shook the hall, it rattled the glasses, it rose like a storm, a tribute to a man who had built legacies, not for himself, but for everyone else. His daughter sat rooted in her chair, her hands lifeless in her lap. The shame on her face was unmistakable, but her eyes betrayed something else now: regret. She had tried to silence him, to hide him, to mold her world without his shadow. Yet now she saw that his shadow was not a blemish but a crown, not an embarrassment but an honor greater than anything she could have manufactured. And though she lowered her gaze, she could not close her ears to the sound of her father's name filling the hall like music. He stood quietly, the award glinting in the light. He did not make a speech. He did not lift his voice to demand anything. His silence was enough. His presence greater than any words. For the truth was already spoken by the host, by the photographs, by the applause, by the undeniable fact that his life had mattered, and mattered deeply. The recognition he had never asked for had come, not as a gift, but as justice. In that silence, in that honor, he no longer felt the sting of betrayal. He no longer carried the ache of invisibility. What he carried now was heavier, yet sweeter. Dignity restored, legacy affirmed, memory preserved. He was no longer just a father, no longer just a man in the shadows. He was a part of history, bound not to be forgotten, his name etched into the story of a people who would carry it long after the chandeliers dimmed. The award rested heavy in his hands, heavier than he expected, though it was not made of stone or iron. Its weight was not in the material, but in everything it represented: nights without sleep, days that stretched into exhaustion, years where he gave more than he ever kept for himself. The polished surface gleamed beneath the lights, reflecting not his face but his journey. The long road of sacrifice that had seemed forgotten now restored in a single moment of truth. He tightened his grip, feeling in the cool solidity of the award something warmer, deeper, proof that his life had mattered, proof that the long seasons of silence had not been in vain. Around him the applause softened into reverent stillness, and he heard the silence more clearly than the clamor. In that silence, he remembered the long winters when his coat was thin, but his children never went hungry. He remembered the aching muscles that carried bricks long after the sun had set. He remembered writing checks, quietly, without fanfare, for schools that bore no plaque with his name, for hospitals that never knew the hand behind their walls. He had asked for nothing, because dignity for him was never found in recognition, but in giving. And yet tonight, the weight in his hands told him that giving had not disappeared into the void. It had built something indestructible. His eyes burned, not from weakness, but from the flood of memory pressing against him. He thought of his late wife, who had stood beside him in those lean years, who had believed with him that their sacrifices would become foundations for the future. He thought of the little girl who had once curled into his lap after a nightmare, whispering, "Don't leave me, Daddy." That little girl now sat at a table not far from him, her face pale with shame, and though the wound of her words cut deep, "Don't embarrass us." The weight of truth now in his hands was heavier than her betrayal, stronger than her denial. The hall looked at him not as an old man leaning on a cane, but as the living embodiment of what endurance and humility create. In the stillness, he did not feel small anymore. He felt immense, not because he demanded honor, but because honor had finally caught up to him, whether his family liked it or not. The award was not a trophy, it was a mirror, reflecting back to him everything he had tried to forget when nights were long and hope was dim. It said without words, "You were never invisible, you were never forgotten, your work outlived your silence." His daughter could not meet his eyes, but the truth no longer needed her acknowledgement. It was larger than her, larger than pride, larger than shame. His grandchildren stared at him with new wonder, their clapping small hands earlier now replaced with wide, unblinking eyes. They saw the man not through their mother's lens, but through the truth of history. And that truth weighed more than blood, more than opinion, more than fear. He bowed his head slightly, holding the award close, as though embracing not the object but the validation of his life. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to breathe without bitterness, to stand without heaviness. The truth was in his hands, undeniable, unerasable. And the truth was heavier than shame, but sweeter than forgiveness. He stood there with the award in his hands, the hall still echoing with the power of his name, and yet he did not turn toward his daughter with reproach. There was no triumph in his eyes, no bitter satisfaction at seeing her pale and trembling in the very moment she had tried to prevent. He did not gloat, he did not accuse, he did not strike back with the sharpness of words. He simply stood in silence, and that silence was louder than anger could ever be. It was a silence carved out of decades of endurance, a silence that needed no voice to prove its worth. The truth itself was his answer. The applause, the photographs, the recognition of strangers had already passed judgment, not on him, but on her. He could have turned to her and reminded her of her whisper, "Don't embarrass us." He could have let the bitterness spill, telling her that she had tried to erase the very man who built the ground beneath her feet. But dignity does not beg for acknowledgement, nor does it waste itself on revenge. His calm, his stillness, became the greatest form of justice. For every second that he remained silent, her shame grew heavier, her mask more fragile, her pride more broken. She had wanted him hidden, and now she sat in the open, exposed before the world, while he shone with a light she could not dim. The guests saw it too. They glanced at her, then at him. The contrast undeniable. His humility towered above her pride. His silence thundered against the hollowness of her ambition. Even the grandchildren sensed it, shifting uneasily at their table, the realization dawning in their young hearts that they had been part of her blindness, that they too had ignored the greatness sitting quietly in their midst. And though he did not condemn them, though no words of reproach escaped his lips, the lesson was branded into them more deeply than if he had shouted. The host invited him to speak, but he only shook his head gently. What could words add to a truth already revealed? What could explanations give that the photographs and applause had not already delivered? Justice was not in speeches. Justice was in presence. Justice was in the unshakable fact that he, once dismissed, now stood at the center, while those who had cast him aside sat diminished. And in that moment the daughter understood. His lack of anger, his refusal to strike back, made her own guilt unbearable. For had he raged, she could have defended herself. Had he scolded, she could have argued. But his silence left no shield, no escape. It forced her to confront herself, her pride, her betrayal. The punishment was not his wrath. It was the mirror of truth that allowed her to see who she had become. The man stood tall, leaning lightly on his cane, the award gleaming in his grasp. His eyes did not search for hers. He did not need her apology. He did not need her recognition. For the justice he carried was not written on her face, but etched in his legacy. And that justice required no fury. It had already spoken, louder than shame, stronger than pride. The days that followed the ceremony moved like a tide he had never expected, each wave carrying his name further than it had ever reached in his lifetime. Newspapers printed his story across their front pages, bold letters spelling out the deeds that had once been hidden in silence. Old photographs were unearthed, interviews reprinted, faces of workers and students resurfacing in chronicles that now declared him a cornerstone of the city's growth. Reporters wrote not of wealth or power, but of a man whose quiet sacrifices had built schools, funded hospitals, and lifted lives without demanding his name be known. For years, his humility had been mistaken for invisibility. Now, His humility had become his crown. At the university where he had once written anonymous checks for scholarships, his portrait was unveiled in the grand hall. Students passed it daily, stopping to read the plaque beneath his image. A life built on service, a legacy that endures. Professors spoke of him as an example, not just of philanthropy, but of dignity that asks for nothing, yet leaves everything behind. Young men and women, many of whom had never met him, began to carry his story as a lesson, quoting his name in essays, invoking his life as inspiration. He had once been the man in the shadows, but now the walls themselves bore witness to his worth. At home the change was quieter, but no less profound. His grandchildren no longer looked at him as simply Grandpa, the man who sat in the corner, patient and silent. They began to ask questions, to listen to his stories with wide eyes, to speak his name with pride in their voices. They repeated to their friends not the whispers their mother had once taught them, but the truth the world had revealed, that their grandfather was not just a man growing old, but a man whose life had shaped their own before they were even born. His presence, once overlooked, became a beacon in their lives. When they looked at him now, they saw not frailty, but greatness clothed in gentleness, a greatness that no betrayal could erase. And even his daughter, though her pride fought against it, could not escape the truth. She found herself speaking differently, her voice softer when she introduced him, her words heavier with acknowledgment she had once withheld. At dinners, she no longer asked him to sit away from the guests. At gatherings, she no longer silenced his voice. She began to say his name with reverence, for she knew that the world had crowned him, and to deny it was to deny herself. Yet he never demanded this change, never forced her hand. His dignity had been his weapon, his silence his shield, and truth had done the rest. He wore no golden crown, no robe of honor, yet he carried something far greater, the crown of dignity. It was in the way strangers bowed their heads when they met him, in the way his story was told in classrooms and echoed in the streets, in the way his family finally began to understand that his worth was not in what he gave them, but in what he left behind for everyone. His legacy was no longer a hidden foundation. It was visible, undeniable, woven into the memory of the city itself. And as he sat by the window one evening, the award resting quietly on the table beside him, he understood that the crown he now bore was not new. It had always been there, forged in silence, built from sacrifice. The world had only just opened its eyes to see it. Years passed, and the night of the award became more than just a memory. It became a story retold in homes, in classrooms, in quiet conversations between generations. Children who had never seen him in person learned his name from teachers who pointed to his portrait in the university hall and said, "This man built more than walls. He built futures." Students wrote essays about him, their words filled with reverence for a life that had never sought applause, but now stood as a standard. His face appeared in textbooks, his name engraved into plaques, his story whispered like a parable. That dignity, though silent, outlasts both mockery and pride. His grandchildren grew into adults, carrying his memory not as a burden, but as a torch. They no longer looked at him with the casual dismissal of youth. Instead, they spoke of him with pride, introducing his name not as my grandfather, but as a symbol of integrity. They told their own children, "You come from a man whose silence was stronger than fury, whose life was greater than words." And never again did they utter the phrase their mother had once whispered in fear, "Don't embarrass us." For they knew now that the only shame had been in their blindness, not in him. His presence, once ignored, had become their inheritance, a legacy of honor they could not measure in wealth, but in truth. The city itself carried him in memory. Streets bore his name, Scholarships honored his spirit. Community centers hung his photograph at their entrance. And each time someone asked who he was, the answer was not just a recitation of his work, but a story of a man who lived quietly, gave everything, asked for nothing, and was finally remembered when the world could no longer look away. His legacy no longer belonged to his family alone. It belonged to everyone who drew strength from the knowledge that greatness is not in loudness, but in endurance. For his daughter, the lesson remained the hardest. She aged, and with age came reflection. In every award her children received, in every opportunity her father's name had helped unlock, she felt the sting of her past words. Don't embarrass us. Yet those words had lost their power. They no longer defined him. They defined her regret. And though he had never once reproached her, never once reminded her of that night, the silence of his forgiveness became its own crown upon her. She carried both shame and gratitude, knowing that her father's story was larger than her pride, and that his dignity had been her truest inheritance. In the end, his name was not just spoken, it was carried. Carried by strangers who had never met him, by students who walked hallways beneath his portrait, by children who played in schools he had once helped build. It lived on, not as an echo of bitterness, but as a melody of honor. And when the years turned to decades, when his chair at family gatherings was empty, and his cane rested untouched, his story remained, stronger than stone, brighter than memory. They remembered him not as a man silenced by whispers, but as a father, a grandfather, a builder whose legacy had outlived the frailty of flesh. His silence had thundered louder than fury, his dignity had crowned him greater than kings, and his memory had proven a truth no betrayal could erase, that worth once revealed cannot be diminished, and that dignity, quiet, enduring, eternal, never grows old.